Bulls will do, not what they should do, but what they will do and how this team will look like come February 7th. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're well, doing well. Now, I didn't do a post-game video last night after that bad loss to the Celtics because there really wasn't much to discuss coming out of that game, going against one of the best teams in the league. No Zach LaVine for the Bulls. Vucevic somehow barely took shots, despite him being the Bulls' leading scorer, with Zach being out of the lineup. Pat and Modest played really well, and they actually looked great when they were out there on the floor together. But anyway, apologies for not doing a post-game video, just wasn't really up for it last night. But regardless, as it relates to the trades for this team, so we know the most likely candidates that are on the trade block for the Bulls: Nikola Vucevic, Zach LaVine, Lonzo Ball. Of course, Jevon Carter, Torrey Craig, if they can somehow get any value for those guys at all. But essentially, they're veteran players who would no longer fit their timeline of going down a path of rebuilding. And also veteran players who managed to gain some value in the trade market when just this offseason, it was expected the Bulls would have to give up assets in order to move on from any of those three in Zach, Vooch, and Lonzo. But despite this being known and reports throughout the season indicating that the Bulls have been taking and making calls, we've seen reports that they plan to be big sellers at the deadline. And we've seen reports that there is no real untouchable player on this roster except for maybe Modest Buzelis. Of course, just recently we saw the Bulls rejected a trade offer from the Atlanta Hawks for a straight Vooch for Capella swap, which, yeah, no kidding, that trade does nothing for the Bulls outside of getting off Vooch's contract for next season, given Capella is on an expiring deal. But Capella doesn't fit the Bulls' timeline. And if you're not getting any form of draft capital, even a second-round pick, what's the point? Because Vooch is more valuable than just a salary dump trade move at this point, as teams have reportedly expressed interest in landing Vucevic for second-round picks. Now, spoiler alert, when it comes to what I believe the Bulls will do at the deadline, it is moving Vucevic. And I hate to say it, that might actually be the only player they move at the deadline. Now, maybe it would include Torrey Craig or Jevon Carter in the package, but in my opinion, I can easily see a scenario where the Bulls try to find a trade for Zach, they try to find a trade for Lonzo, but they end up overvaluing them on the market and don't budge on any offers coming from other teams. Because look, here's the thing. We know this front office tends to overvalue their players on the trade market. It's why they've made very few trades over the last 3 years, because teams weren't willing to meet the Bulls in their asking price. And conversely, the Bulls weren't willing to let their players go for pennies on the dollar. Now, you could argue they sold low on Alex Caruso, but that's a different debate entirely, since in their view, they saw Giddey as a young, established player that they could build with as part of their new youth movement. Whether you agree with it or not, that was their belief and why they pursued Giddey so heavily. So if I was a betting man, I would say the Bulls do, in fact, move Vucevic hours leading up to the deadline. I think it'll be a last-minute trade. The Bulls, for the next week, are going to hold out and continue to try and push for a first-round pick for Vooch. No team will be willing to meet that asking price for a player who's 34 years old, a player that's been productive and having a much better season. But a first-round pick is a steep asking price for any team taking him on, knowing he probably only has 1 to 2 good years left in him. Thus, the Bulls will end up having to settle for a couple of second-round picks for Vucevic, and my guess is he'll most likely be going to the Golden State Warriors. Now, the question is, what would the Bulls get in return for that deal in terms of players? Because you can't just switch out Vucevic for a couple seconds. You also have to make the money work. Vooch is making $20 million, so you have to take back around that much money as well. And my guess is it would likely come in the form of Kevon Looney and Gary Payton II, both players on expiring deals, so the Bulls wouldn't have to keep them on their books for next season. I know some will say, really? Looney and Payton for Vucevic? That's not worth it at all. No, the point is, you get a little bit of draft capital that you could even package in a deal down the line as a sweetener in a trade, and you also free up salary for the next season, given Vooch is still owed $20 million next year, which is important, especially if the Bulls are in fact able to find a trade for Zach, where they would be able to get his money off the books, giving the Bulls ample cap space going into this rebuild starting next season. Now, the reason I don't see Zach LaVine getting traded is because, one, I would not be surprised if the Bulls front office, because of Zach's improved play and having one of the best seasons of his career, if they suddenly pivot and say, hey, we should actually keep Zach and try to build this younger core with him. I could totally see them deluding themselves into thinking that keeping Zach LaVine around, letting him play out his contract, may not be a bad thing. Not only for keeping the team quote-unquote competitive, but also for the younger guys to play with and work with a veteran star player like Zach. And I especially think that's even more so the case when teams are probably going to be unwilling still to give up much for Zach LaVine, when the Bulls are wanting a big haul for him if they are in fact going to trade him. Because Zach would have been traded by now if some team was making an all-in type push to get him, where they were shelling out multiple first-round picks and or young players. But because of his contract, even though he is playing to the level of that contract now, but because of that contract, it makes it incredibly difficult to make a deal work for some of these contending teams who are already operating over the luxury tax aprons. It doesn't mean it can't happen, but teams continue to be cautious when it comes to overspending and taking on high dollar value contracts that could have ramifications on their future spending, as well as impacting future draft picks with the new rules in place that limit your ability to trade picks out 7 years in the future, and also your first round pick getting moved to the very end of the first round if you remain in the second apron for too long. The other reason I could see Zach staying beyond the deadline is because even he has said more recently, or at least it came out in a report, that he actually wants to remain in Chicago for the rest of the season. Now, whether that was just lip service, we don't know, but my guess is, one, it has to do with the fact that he's about to have a new baby, which shout out to him and congrats. And as a father, and me remembering those times when I had a newborn, yeah, you just want to focus on family and not have to worry about the potential of uprooting your whole life and family after having a brand new baby. But also, I feel like Zach has kind of accepted his role. He's at peace with where he is in his life and his career and isn't eager to push for a trade like he did over a year ago. And because Zach has remained professional, carried himself well, has obviously played incredibly well, I can easily see Zach remaining on this team post-deadline. The Bulls aren't going to trade him for scraps because he actually has value now. And unless that value is met in a trade offer, they're not going to trade him just to trade him because the fans want to see a sell-off. And then when it comes to Lonzo Ball, I mentioned this before a few weeks back. I honestly wouldn't be opposed to the Bulls keeping Lonzo and signing him to an extension for a cheap veteran deal. Now, whether Lonzo would actually do that is a different story, but Lonzo could really fit with any roster in the NBA. And that includes a roster such as the Bulls, who need to develop their young players, who need a locker room voice, a high IQ player, and his presence on the court. And Lonzo Ball is that guy. And that's the other thing. The Bulls could try and sign him to keep him around for another season and then flip him for more value down the line, because even though Lonzo has been playing well, he has far and away exceeded everyone's expectations when most thought he would never play again. But I do still think teams are going to be a bit hesitant when it comes to trading for this guy because of his injury history and, of course, still being on a minutes restriction. But with another season under his belt, and if he's able to return healthy and even ramp up some of those minutes, yeah, the Bulls could likely get more for him. And in that instance, it likely makes sense to try and hold on to him long term as a savvy veteran leader for the young guys, and then getting more value for him than you otherwise would in this next week before the deadline. Now, when it comes to some of these younger guys who have been floated around here and there in rumors about potential Bulls trades or just hearing what fans have been saying, but guys like Kobe, Ayo, Patrick Williams, well, I'm sure the Bulls have been taking calls on these guys, engaging their interest and value on the market, as they should be doing. That's part of their job. I really don't think any of them are getting moved. Now, in my view, and I talked about this before, it would probably behoove the Bulls to seriously consider trading Coby White, because you could get a decent haul for him given his contract and production and age, and the Bulls are soon going to have to pay him anyway. If you are going to fully embrace the rebuild, is Kobe going to be part of that, or do you try to capitalize on his value to double down on the rebuild and get more picks and or younger players than Coby White is at this point in time? But regardless, at the end of the day, I really don't see any of these young guys getting moved unless some team just makes too good of an offer for the Bulls to refuse, where you have to jump on it. So outside of that, then no, they're going to retain their young guys as the building blocks for the future. So I know it's kind of underwhelming, but just knowing this front office, if I had to predict what the Bulls are going to do from now until next week, it's really only a matter of trading Nikola Vucevic. I think the roster, for the most part, remains intact. Of course, now we'll see all these trade announcements right after I post this video. But anyway, let me know what you guys think. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.